Hello and welcome to another edition of the China Global South podcast, a proud member of the Sinica Podcast Network. I'm Eric Olander. Today we're going to head back to Southeast Asia, my part of the world where I live, and we're going to focus on Vietnam. And this is one of the most interesting places to look at when we look at the U.S.-China great power competition, because nowhere is more exposed to both the United States and China than Vietnam right now. And this has been a very big topic of interest because Vietnam became the second country after the United Kingdom to finalize what they're calling a trade deal, but really it's more like an outline, a framework. We have very little details on it. But U.S. President Donald Trump, he posted on Truth Social a couple of weeks ago that Vietnam would receive 20% tariffs on all products made in Vietnam and 40% tariffs on all transshipments from China to the United States. Now, that's basically all we know. This caught the Vietnamese a little bit by surprise, if you go by a Politico story. They were under the impression that they were going to get a deal somewhere in the 11 to 12% range, and they still have not formally confirmed what Donald Trump said on Truth Social about the 2040 deal. So it leaves us to believe that there's still some negotiations that are underway. That being said, the Vietnamese are not standing still. In the immediate aftermath of the announcement from Donald Trump, the Vietnamese Prime Minister Pham Minh Chinh, he went to the BRICS summit and spoke with his Chinese counterpart and said they're going to call for closer China trade and Chinese investment. And that is something that is a little bit counterintuitive based on what you think the Americans are trying to do, which is trying to break the relationship between the United States and Vietnam. Between Vietnam and China, sorry about that. Let's get a perspective on this from somebody who I admire a lot, who follows this story very closely. Khang Vu is a visiting scholar in the political science department at Boston College. He's a regular contributor to our show and one of the keenest observers of U.S.-China-Vietnam relations. A very good morning to you, Khang.
Yeah, thanks for having me again on your podcast, Eric.
It's great to have you. I've been wanting to speak with you for the past couple of weeks, watching everything that's been unfolding among the Vietnamese, Chinese, and the Americans in particular. You wrote a column for The Diplomat this last week, which said, "Why Vietnam will not balance against China." And what you're doing is you're challenging one of the core assumptions that the Americans are making here, is that they're trying again to put some distance between Vietnam and China. You say that this is a faulty premise and that Vietnam does not and will not become part of an American coalition to challenge China. Let's start there about why you think the premise of the U.S. argument is flawed.
So I think it's wrong because of the over attention to U.S. trade and military leverage over Vietnam. So we often hear a lot of talks about like how the U.S. matters to the Pacific security and how the U.S. can stand up to China and then help the smaller Asian country around Chinese periphery to stand up to China. And I personally don't think that makes sense for Vietnam in particular, because for sure, yes, the U.S. is a strong country, I agree, but Vietnam is different from other U.S. allies like Japan, Korea, the Philippines, and Thailand. Vietnam borders China, and that is a fundamental difference. The problem with that is that the Chinese, they always will have military advantage over Vietnam, even when Vietnam is allied with another country. Vietnam tried that in the Third Indochina War when it allied with the Soviet Union to balance against China pretty much. And what Vietnam got was pretty much an invasion from China and a decade of Chinese coercion and punishment after that. And the Soviet Union, even it is really, really close. It basically borders China and it's closer to Vietnam than the United States is, but it could not do anything to stop it. So what I am trying to say here is that, sure, the U.S. is strong, but when we put that into the context of the China-Vietnam relationship, then the United States cannot really do much to help Vietnam, especially when it comes to any military assistance. Another point I want to say here is that the U.S. also overestimating its trade leverage. I understand that Vietnam relies a lot on access to U.S. market, especially when the U.S. is the biggest export market for Vietnamese products. But sure, that matters to Vietnam economic growth. But it doesn't really matter that much to Vietnam's security. Because based on my own research, Vietnam will always prioritize security over its economy. What I'm saying here is that like it will be willing to put up with economic austerity instead of compromising its own security. Basically, the fancy version of eating grass and holding my guns. So what I'm saying here is that it makes sense from the US perspective to trying to leverage that trade dependence, Vietnam trade dependence, to break Vietnam away from China. But my research pretty much show that Vietnam is really willing to weather that kind of trade punishment. If that means not pissing off China simply because China is so important to Vietnam. I mean, like Vietnam can lose the US as a trade market, as a market for its export, but in the situation that it pisses off China, then we obviously don't want to repeat of a third Indochina war, Chinese invasion, and a decade of Chinese punishment after that. The US can provide to Vietnam, what the US can provide to Vietnam can never be outweighed by what the Chinese can do to Vietnam.
So in many ways, again, just to summarize what you were saying, that in contrast to many other countries in Asia, say the Philippines, where the security partnership with the United States is absolutely indispensable, the United States doesn't have that leverage with Vietnam. Let's come back to the security question, because I think that's very important. I want to focus on this trade issue in part because that's what the tariffs ostensibly are about right now. Let me just give everybody a summary of where we are in the trade numbers. Last year, in 2024, total two-way trade between the U.S. and Vietnam reached $149.6 billion. Most of that is Vietnamese goods going to the United States, about $123 billion trade surplus. That's what got under the skin of U.S. officials, Howard Lutnick, Donald Trump, Peter Navarro. These are all the senior American officials, including the president, who really despise this massive trade surplus. Vietnam only purchased about $13 billion of goods from the United States. We're now expecting that number to go up significantly as part of this new trade deal, energy purchases, Boeing planes, things like that. The problem is, though, is that the United States doesn't sell a lot of things that the Vietnamese need, such as the consumer goods that the Chinese do. Now, let's look at China trade. China-Vietnam trade last year reached a high of $205 billion. So when we look at trade, Vietnam trades more with China than it does with the United States. Imports from China, $144 billion. Exports from Vietnam to China, $83 billion, a lot of agriculture in particular. So, Khang, one of the complaints and the perceptions in the United States is they've seen this massive increase of imports from China to Vietnam. And there's this chart that's been circulating around Washington that shows Chinese exports to Vietnam and Vietnamese exports to the United States. Both seem to be going up in tandem. That is at the core of this concern that the Americans have about transshipments. You contend, though, that the concern about transshipments is misplaced. Why?
So I think the problem with that data is you see a correlation between those two charts, like Vietnamese buying more from China and it's selling more to the US. That is simply a correlation. It's not causation. So what the research that I've been consulting here simply shows that, yes, Vietnam is buying more from China, but also buying more from other countries to make stuff that is selling to the United States. So what we need to be really talking about here is increasing importance role of Vietnam in the global supply chain. Vietnam is buying more stuff from other countries to be able to make more stuff to sell that to the United States. Obviously, I'm not on the ground. I'm not in the supply chain business, so that I cannot give you an expert take on this. But a lot of the research done by, let's say, the Lowy Institute or other think tank in the US or in Australia, for example, they all agree that Vietnam is not really just a place for the Chinese to just put on the Made in Vietnam stamp and then sell it back to the US. The story is much more complicated than that. And the problem, again, with the US side is that they simply look at a chart, a graph and a chart, and then they simply say that, hey, what Vietnam is doing is just not acceptable. And they're just telling the Vietnamese to break away from China. And that is simply a really misleading take because Vietnam economy and the Chinese economy is so intertwined, especially when Vietnam is so small. And a lot of the stuff that Vietnam needs, raw material, comes from China. Like if you are telling Vietnam to just break away from China, then Vietnam will not be able to buy the stuff. That is need to make the stuff that it will sell later to the United States. I mean, that's just so complicated. Another thing I want to point out here is that the kind of attitude that you see from the Donald Trump administration, like Peter Navarro, he went online and then he said that Vietnam is basically a Chinese colony. That really, really hurt a lot of
Yeah.
goodwill in U.S.-Vietnam relations. Like,
Yeah, that did not go down well in Hanoi at all.
obviously, it doesn't go down well, especially a lot of the, I mean, Vietnam has done a lot of effort to trying to show the U.S., especially the Donald Trump administration, that they are open to trade with the U.S. and they are open to renegotiate the deal. But the kind of attitude is really not a good start to begin with. And I also think that Vietnam is also concerned about a geopolitical motive, especially the motive that the U.S. want to contain China and want to use its trade leverage with Vietnam to really isolate Vietnam from China. And I think that really concerns Vietnam the most because as you see that Vietnam is and cannot be detached from China whatsoever in terms of military, in terms of economy. It doesn't make sense for Vietnam to do so, especially they understand that the US is far away and China is close by. So I think that I understand the US concern, but I think that the US need to really temper its expectation and really have a clear view of what leverage it can use over Hanoi to get what it wants.
I'm curious to get a sense of what you're hearing from the people you speak with in Vietnam about the current state of relations. When the Liberation Day tariffs came out, remember that was something like April 2nd or something like that, and Donald Trump called this Liberation Day. He announced that Vietnam would have a 46% tariff rate. And this was shocking to a lot of people in Vietnam. And it was shocking in Southeast Asia more broadly. Cambodia got 50%. I think it was 34% in Malaysia, very high tariffs. Southeast Asia were among the highest in the world. And there was really a sense of anger and disappointment. And the fact that these announcements came around the same time as the 50th anniversary of the end of the war was also not lost on people. And there was this sense that, listen, we fought a struggle against the Americans a half a century ago. If we have to fight another struggle against the Americans now, we will. And there was this real sense that a lot of the progress that had been made in U.S.-Vietnam relations had been undermined by these massive tariffs. The feeling that I get from talking to people is that this 20% tariff, while it's better, is still very, very high, particularly for industries like textiles, apparel, footwear, that operate on very small margins. I mean, a 20% tariff can wipe out the margins and can make Vietnam a much less competitive place to manufacture than, say, other countries that are operating on a 10% tariff, for example. What's your sense right now from what you're picking up, both from the social media, the media discourses, and the conversations you're having with Vietnamese stakeholders about how they feel about all of this?
I think I agree with you, Eric, is that the sentiment is disappointment and a betrayal of a lot of progress that Vietnam and US made in the past 3 decades. So I will say that the US put a lot of emphasis on, hey, we want to make Vietnam be a strong, independent, and prosperous country. And then at the end of the day, they slapped a 46% tariffs on Vietnam based on a really sketchy calculation. We can agree by now it's really, really sketchy calculation. It's not based on any economic metric whatsoever. So the immediate reaction from Vietnam to that 46% tariffs is pretty much that, hey, we have been through so many things that is even worse than this. We fought the wars against the Americans, we fought the war against the French, and we could do the same. Tariff is nothing. Again, that pretty much reflects my argument that Vietnam will always prioritize security over economy. And one of the immediate reaction that the Vietnamese government had was that, hey, the US is a big market, we understand that, but we will shift or we will diversify our export market elsewhere to Europe. It will be painful. It will take a lot of effort, but we will do it because the US just showed to us that it is not a reliable trade partner. And another thing about the number, the 46%, again, it is out of nowhere. And even though the US just gave Vietnam a 20% number and a 40% on transshipment, I think that there is a lot of similar reaction to that transshipment clause because it's so vague. Like the US can pretty much put anything that Vietnam buys from China to sell to the US as transshipment, even though that can be genuine Vietnam, made in Vietnam product. again, also the 20% clause, Vietnam really wants the tariff rate on Vietnam to be at least 10% lower than its competitor. Let's say India, Indonesia, Malaysia, or other country in the Pacific, because that 10% lower is the margin that makes Vietnam a competitive market for foreign investor. Like yesterday or 2 days ago, Trump announced a 19% tariff on Indonesia. That is a no-no to Vietnam because that will pretty much ship a lot of the money, foreign monies to Indonesia. And in this situation, Vietnam was. That's why I think that's why Vietnam has not confirmed the Trump statement yet, because they are pretty much trying to negotiate a deal that they find acceptable, as you say earlier in the podcast, Eric, around 11 or 15%, pretty much like 5 or 10% lower than its regional competitors. I think that if you put that into the bigger perspective of U.S.-Vietnam relation, is that the comprehensive strategic partnership that Vietnam and the U.S. inked in 2023. From the Vietnamese side, there was a lot of hope that the upgrade to that highest tier of partnership in the Vietnamese diplomatic ranking would make a stronger case for Vietnam to get its non-market economy status lift, and at least lower the tariff rate in for its good going to the U.S. But what Vietnam got in return was 2024, the Biden refused to lift that label against Vietnam. In 2025, everything went downhill when the Trump administration slapped at least now 20% tariffs on Vietnamese product. And from the Vietnamese perspective, it was like, hey, we put a lot of effort into this, and what we got in return was nothing. And that comprehensive strategic partnership did not come cheap from the Vietnamese perspective, because in return, they had to reassure China that, hey, this new partnership was not an attempt by Vietnam to ally with the U.S. against China, and in return, Vietnam had to join Xi Jinping Community of Common Destiny as a way to show China that, hey, we are serious about China-Vietnam relation, and we want to maintain this level of friendliness that we had in the past few years. So from the Vietnamese perspective, and especially with that lack of announcement from the Vietnamese side, I think that they are both disappointed, and they still hope that somehow they can negotiate a better deal than the 20% rate.
Yeah, the Vietnamese government is already signaling its displeasure with the U.S. right now. And let me just read you a quote. And again, the Vietnamese, unlike say Malaysia, where Anwar Ibrahim, the prime minister, is very outspoken, the Vietnamese tend to be much more reserved and guarded in their comments. So when comments do come out, they should be taken with a lot more weight than you'd hear from, say, other governments that tend to be more open. Particularly right now, you're hearing a lot coming out of Singapore. Lawrence Wong there, the prime minister, very, very outspoken in his criticism of the United States, along with Anwar Ibrahim as well. The Vietnamese tend to be more subdued about it. But when Deputy Trade Minister Phan Thi Thang, when she said, and I'm going to quote here, this is from Reuters, with 16 free trade agreements, Vietnam is expanding its export markets to reduce its reliance on the United States market. That has to be taken very seriously. And that seems to be the strategy, that if the United States is going to put up these barriers, as you pointed out, it's going to be difficult to replace that 30% of the exports that go from Vietnam to the United States. But they believe that with all these free trade agreements, they can rely more on Europe, on India, on Australia, on Japan, and of course, on the China market. One question that I have for you, though, as we talked in the beginning of the program, was about this influx of imports from China to Vietnam. There's also been a relocation of a lot of Chinese manufacturing into particularly northern Vietnam, around Haiphong in that area. The Americans see that as, listen, this is just the Chinese trying to find a backdoor into the American market. And so we have this very important distinction that the American Chamber of Commerce in Vietnam is asking the Trump administration for clarification on. Does made in China, that means products from China, is that the same as made by China? So maybe Chinese factories in Vietnam. What's your take on all of the offshoring that's happening from China to Vietnam? And that is potentially a concern for the United States in terms of trying to evade U.S. tariffs on China.
I think we need to look at Vietnam, foreign investment in Vietnam, from the perspective of the country multilateral foreign policy. So we often think that trade and offshoring really just about trade and offshoring. It doesn't make any sense from a perspective of Vietnamese government. What they're trying to do here is that we were economically isolated during the Third Indochina War during the 1980s when the Chinese and the American were pretty much, and the UN pretty much everywhere, except the Soviet bloc, were putting a blockade or economic sanctions on Vietnam, and that hurts Vietnam a lot. And that put Vietnam in an unfavorable position of being economically dependent on the Soviet Union. And obviously, you don't want to be economically independent on any country. So after the fall of the Soviet bloc, 1991, what the Vietnamese government decided that, hey, if you want to avoid that situation of economic dependence on any particular bloc or power, then we need to accept monies from every country. Pretty much a multilateral take on global affairs. So with that spirit of multilateralism, you have a multilateral foreign policy. Vietnam is friend to all and enemy to none. And with that, you also have a multilateral foreign trade relation. Vietnam is a trade partner with any country that it can trade with, not just with the US. So from that perspective, what the Vietnamese government is trying to do here is that with that perspective on neutrality, with a stable political environment, and with a big population, I will say that 100 million is huge comparing to other countries in Southeast Asia, just not huge with China. So sometimes we forget that Vietnam is a pretty much significant market on its own, just that just small vis-a-vis China. So with that take on multilateralism, what the Vietnamese government trying to do here is that we will say yes to foreign money so long as that it can create jobs to the population, so long as they respect Vietnamese law, and so long as Vietnamese business can learn from foreign businesses. So in this situation, Vietnam accepting Chinese money or Chinese investment doesn't mean that Vietnam is trying to trick the US whatsoever. Completely opposite what Trump said when Xi Jinping was in Hanoi, that they were teaming up against us. No, it's not the case.
He said they're trying to screw us.
Yeah,
that was his famous word.
So what the Vietnamese trying to do here is that if you go to Vietnam, bring in your money, and with your opportunity, then we will accept it, no matter what you do. So the problem with the Trump administration is here is telling the Vietnamese that, hey, we want you to drop your multilateral trade foreign relation, whatever, side with us, trying to break away from China, and you will have U.S. access to U.S. market, you will have access to U.S. military hardware. And from the Vietnamese perspective, was like, that is against our fundamental principle of a multilateral foreign relation, trade relation, whatsoever. And that is really costly. And that would put Vietnam into a position of dependence on the US, whether that is trade, whether that's military. And that is a no-no. So what the Vietnamese is trying to do here is that, hey, they are still accepting Chinese money, but at the same time, they are trying to reassure the US that what we are doing with China doesn't have anything to do with what we are doing to you. And made in Vietnam product is still made in Vietnam product. And we will do our best to crack down on counterfeit goods or goods without a clear origin. If you read a lot of stuff on the Vietnamese media these days, especially after the trade crackdown, you will see that the Vietnamese are really, really serious about cracking down small businesses without.
I can tell you from firsthand experience that Saigon Center, which is one of these big shopping areas in downtown Saigon, which has was famous for selling fake Prada and fake Chanel, it's all been shut down. They came in and they locked it down, and so a lot of the tourists who came to Saigon Center looking for the fake goods, they were very disappointed that they didn't do it. They can't find them anymore. But that is the real play out of what you're saying, is that they are cracking down on counterfeit goods now.
Yeah, I think that is really makes sense because if the Vietnamese can demonstrate to the U.S. government that, hey, we are cracking down on these fake Gucci bag or Chanel bag or fake whatever, then we are buying more from you. And not only just these high-end product, then Vietnam is also a big fan of iPhones and whatever. So, if they're cracking down on all of these made in China, and you know that China is a big producer of iPhones, and if Vietnam can really cracking down on these products, then that can send a strong commitment to the U.S. that Vietnam is closing all the loopholes, and Vietnam is really willing to buy more U.S. product. And as of today, then, and per Trump announcement, then Vietnam is pretty much open its market to U.S. product at 0% tariff, and that is just generous.
But part of it is to crack down in response to the U.S. demands, but also part of it is just the maturing of the Vietnamese economy. And this is the same thing I saw in China, where I remember right next to the U.S. embassy in the 90s, there were these alleyways where you could buy fake products of all kinds. And it was just very ironic that it was right next door to the U.S. embassy. But as the Chinese economy grew and as it developed and as intellectual property became more of a concern, they started to crack down. And I think the same thing is happening in Vietnam as well. This is as much in response to the United States as is a domestic response as well. The Vietnamese are creating intellectual property of their own. There is now, for example, if you try to go to file sharing networks on any of the Vietnamese internet services, it's blocked. You have to use a VPN to get to it. So they're putting up these roadblocks to encourage people not to pirate movies and to buy cheap and goods like that. So you definitely see that happening. Very quickly on, just a little anecdote that I want to share with you, that I spoke with an analyst in Ho Chi Minh City a couple of weeks ago, and he said, listen, there's a silver lining here. Right now, and again, this is counterintuitive for a lot of people, is that Vietnam, even though it has a population of 105 million people, is now running into quite acute labor shortages. The cost of labor is rising. And so what this analyst was saying, and I'd like to get your take on it, was that if the 20% tariff sticks and some of that low-end manufacturing ends up leaving to cheaper markets, the benefit is that it's going to free up labor pools for higher end value products. So NVIDIA is setting up shop. If you go up to northern Vietnam, all of the tech companies are setting up. And one of the concerns is that they can't find workers. They can't find labor to work in higher end manufacturing. So this is going to be a painful transition. But in the end, this analyst is saying it might actually be the best thing as Vietnam starts to move up the value chain out of that low-end apparel textile part, which is something that, again, maybe Vietnam's moving into middle-income status. It's not there yet, but it's getting close. But maybe a lower-income country will take over that apparel and let that labor now shift into higher value goods, auto manufacturing, technology, infrastructure, those types of things. What do you say about that theory?
I would say that that is the ideal outcome that everyone in Vietnam wants. We want to move to a higher chain. We want to be able to reallocate a lot of these workers to these new factory. We want to nurture a high skill group labor. But I would say that what a lot of these arguments are forgetting is that the process of transition will be really, really painful, and we don't know how long that will last. Some country is stuck forever in the middle income trap. Some country will never get that kind of technological push to push them to the other side of the chain. And another thing that is really unfortunate for Vietnam, along a lot of these talk about these trade war, is that the country is in the midst of a very huge domestic restructuring. If we talk about the era of national rise that Secretary General Tolam laid out around August last year, it is a really, really ambitious program.
It's dramatic. I mean, it is. And just to give people an idea, they went from somewhere in about 63 provinces down to 34. They've cut national media outlets. They've cut ministry sizes. It has been a dramatic. I mean, you take what Elon Musk tried to do with Doge and put it on steroids, and that's what they've done in Vietnam. It has been a dramatic restructuring, and on top of it, there's been an ongoing anti-corruption campaign that seems to be paired with this as well. So the politics are quite sensitive right now for this to be happening at a time when there's so much domestic restructuring. And I guess anytime you're cutting that many positions from government, you're also creating some frustrations and potential rivals within the society who are not happy with those cuts because they're losing power and they're losing jobs.
I would say that the government expects the thing about the era of national rise is that the government laid it out around August last year. They didn't expect the trade war with the U.S. or the 46% tariff or a lot of restructuring in terms of foreign trade relation. What they were betting on is that, hey, with a really calm and stable international environment, then we might clean our house a little bit because the house is getting messy. What they're saying here is that, hey, there is a lot of bloating in the government and there is a lot of inefficiency. So we need to be able to clean the house before we can really propel the country forward. And the government expected a lot of pain in the short term. You pretty much had to buy out the government officials that were getting laid off. You actually have to condense a lot of the offices. You downsize from a 3 level of administration to just 2 level, and then you cut the number of province. That is huge. That is, I don't know how long that would take for Vietnam, but my take is that at least 10 or 15 years, because based on my own experience with when Hanoi merged with a nearby province in 2008, the house was not in order until 10 years after that. So with this scale of restructuring, and then with this scale of like you moving labor from one sector to the other or from different level of skill set to one another, this will be a mess.
So again, this is very important here. So while there's this massive political restructuring, there is now the potential for rather significant economic restructuring if these tariffs force changes in, what kinds of products the Vietnamese make. Very quickly, let's go back to the security side of things. There is, again, this perception in the United States that because of historical suspicions of China among many Vietnamese, in fact, the Vietnamese public oftentimes expresses far more skepticism of China than what you see from Vietnamese leaders publicly. There is this perception that maybe the Vietnamese can be on our side, and maybe we can pull them into this coalition along with the Philippines, along with Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, that will be part of the encirclement of China to contain China. That's always been a faulty assumption, as you pointed out. I remember delegations of American think tankers and officials last year came, and they were very excited because the Vietnamese told them what they wanted to hear. Yeah, we don't like China. But that was only part of the story, because the Vietnamese have this other side, as you've talked about, that they want to make sure that China the dragon is happy and content and does not breathe fire on them. But interestingly, there is this perception in Washington that the Vietnamese might be a very large market for American weapons, even though the Vietnamese have purchased a lot of their hardware from the Russians. Previously, it was the Soviets. Now they're buying from the Indians, but a lot of the Indian weapons also have Soviet designs in them as well. So there's some synergy between the Indian weaponry and the Russian weaponry that they buy. So there's an ecosystem there. There was a weapons and arms embargo that was in force until 2016. And you noted in your column that since 2016, the Vietnamese have not taken advantage of the opportunity to buy American armaments. And there doesn't seem to be any indication that they will do so now. Why is that? And does that have anything to do with China?
So I would say, let's start with the point about Vietnam is always being skeptical of China. I agree with that. The thing about Vietnam and China relations is that it's complicated. And if you aren't skeptical of China, then you probably are not a Vietnamese. If you go to Vietnam, you know that all the streets there are named
It's
after
in the mother's milk. It really is in the mother's milk. I mean, from the
China.
baby all the way up, it's true.
All the streets are named after anti-China hero. Everywhere you see like people that fighting against China is being revered. But again, this is a really huge but. There is a difference between being skeptical of China and being pragmatic. You hate your neighbor, but you need your neighbor to survive. That is a fundamental lesson that Vietnam learned from its 1,000 year coexistence with China. If you look at the really long history when Vietnam gained independence from China around the year like 938, then we will see a pattern clear in that Vietnamese emperor, they fought against China, they called China invaders. But you know what happened after they fought against China? They sent a delegation to China and told the Chinese that, hey, we will submit to you. We are your vassal. So that the Chinese will not launch another invasion. Sure, Vietnam can fight against 1, 2, or 3 Chinese invasion, but what about the 4th or the 5th one, the 6th one? Like, you know that Vietnam is a small country vis-a-vis China. And Vietnam didn't want that to happen. All the Vietnamese emperors, they didn't want that to happen. They could fight China once or 2 or twice, maybe 3 times, 4 times, but they could not fight China forever. What the lesson here is that Vietnam will defend its independence from China, but Vietnam will let China know that, hey, we want to be your friendly neighbor. That is a lesson that the current Vietnamese government is trying to learn as well. they broke that understanding in the Third Indochina War. They fought against China in 1979, and what they did after that was they kept on siding with the Soviet Union against China, and that pissed off the Chinese pretty much. And the decade after that was the Chinese. They stationed 1 million troops along the China-Vietnam border. They didn't have to launch a second invasion, and Vietnam already had to arm race with China to bankruptcy, pretty much to bankruptcy at that point. And that is a lesson that Vietnam did not want to repeat. Sure, Vietnam is skeptical of China, and Vietnam and China still have differences over the South China Sea islands. But Vietnam understood that we cannot be on on bad terms with China forever. So that is a part that U.S. policymakers don't understand, and they don't want to listen because they thought that, hey, Vietnam being skeptical of China, hey, let's sell them weapons, and they're gonna be on our side because they're skeptical of China. But they forgot a really huge second part of the equation right there.
One of the things that the Americans, I think, seem to be looking at is what's happening in the South China Sea, as you mentioned. And land reclamation around the Spratly Islands, if I'm correct, has been going up by the Vietnamese. And that has provoked a response from the Chinese. A couple months ago, there was live fire exercises on the Chinese side of the border of the Gulf of Tonkin. That is something we have not seen before. The Chinese do not seem to be harassing the Vietnamese the same way that they're doing the Philippines. And you've pointed out in previous writing that that's because the Vietnamese do not have an external partner backing them up, whereas the Philippines has the United States. And so the Chinese see this as part of the great power competition in the South China Sea. But for the Vietnamese, they call it the East Sea, the East Vietnam Sea. The South China Sea does remain a flashpoint. The Vietnamese are not backing down. They are expanding their territorial footprint in that, in what they believe is their sovereign right to do so. Where does this go? Because it does seem like the Vietnamese and the Chinese are on a path that is not necessarily conducive for the type of harmonious relationship that they have on their land continental border, which is very different than in their maritime borders. Talk to us a little bit about how this is unfolding in the South China Sea and the East Vietnam Sea.
So I would say that the South China Sea dispute still remain a major flashpoint in China-Vietnam relations. But it is the only flashpoint in China-Vietnam relations. And many times you see a lot of China and Vietnam leaders, when they met each other, they will say that we recognize there are differences, but we don't want that difference to spill over into other areas of cooperation. And I think what both sides understood here is that China will assert its sovereign rights in the South China Sea the same way that Vietnam will assert its sovereign right in the South China Sea. The same way that China is building its island and the same way Vietnam is building its island. But the main difference here is that when you look at other areas of cooperation, both sides are still making progress. That is a huge difference when you are talking about China asserting sovereign rights vis-a-vis the Philippines. Because when you see in the case of the Philippines, the Chinese, they're bullying the Philippines, and the Philippines cannot even resupply their outposts in the South China Sea. When you look at the Vietnamese, based on CSIS data, they are expanding their islands at a record pace.
Yeah, quite significantly. I mean, it's not a small expansion. It's very, very sizable.
And the Chinese, they simply just didn't do anything. And
Yeah,
the Vietnamese are
which
looking
was surprising.
yeah, and then they say like, hey, if they just turn a blind eye to what we are doing, then that might be a good thing, because there's no way China is gonna giving back Vietnam the parcel or its island in the Spratly, because that China has already incorporated those islands into the Chinese territory, and they already say it's so pretty clear that they were not gonna do that. So even though the conflict, I don't see an end to the South China Sea dispute. But the dispute being frozen right now is to the benefits of the Vietnamese. And I think that the Vietnamese government want to keep it that way. Because again, back to our point earlier, Vietnam want to maintain a friendly external environment for domestic restructuring, especially when Trump's tariff only gonna make that job harder for Vietnam.
Yeah, let's close our discussion looking forward. And I want to understand a little bit your take on General Secretary To Lam. He's still relatively new in power. He took over for General Secretary Chom, who passed away. And General Secretary Chom was one of the old guard from the wartime generation. To Lam, who is not young, but certainly not as old as General Secretary Chom, seems to have a different approach, especially regarding China. He made two interesting, you know, he made two interesting visits during his first visit to China, which was his first overseas visit, as is customary for a new Vietnamese leader. He went to go see Ho Chi Minh's. There's a memorial for Ho Chi Minh in Guangzhou. That was something that had not been done before. And then, more importantly, he went to Mao's mausoleum in Beijing. And that was significant as well. And again, given the very tense history between China and Vietnam, many people saw that as a very potent statement on the part of the General Secretary that he wanted to take China-Vietnam relations into a different direction. In the context now of this trade, I don't know if it's a war, if it's a dispute, if it's tensions with the United States, and what seem to be warming relations, at least economically and politically, between the communist parties and the governments of Vietnam and China. Where do you see Vietnam going forward in this new environment? And what do you see General Secretary To Lam taking in terms of where he wants to take the country?
I would say that what happened in the past year or so since General Secretary To Lam went into power is quite new in terms of Vietnam multilateral foreign policy. You saw a secretary paying visit to these, we often say that in Vietnam, like red sites in China. You say a Vietnamese leader paying homage to Mao Zedong Mausoleum. You also see that during the 50th anniversary of the end of war in Vietnam, that the Chinese military was actually invited.
That's right. The PLA sent their honor guard, a small honor guard delegation to march in the parade as well.
And also that is going to be the case for the 80th anniversary.
And by the way, they were very well received by the people on the street. In particular, many of the young women were screaming out how handsome the PLA soldiers were, and so that again was a big surprise, and in my view was a very big missed opportunity by the United States to not use the anniversary of the war as a moment of reconciliation. I mean, you could have imagined a moment where the United States, together with Vietnam, said, we fought this brutal war 50 years ago against one another, but here we are today as partners, and there might have been a handover of flags or an exchange of some kind of commemorative items from that time to say we're going forward. Trump initially banned U.S. diplomats from participating in the ceremony, and then later allowed diplomats to just sit in the stands. Real big missed opportunity, and I think the Chinese, as you pointed out, with the deployment of the honor guard to the parade, was a very, very adept move.
Yeah, and they are gonna also send a contingent to the 80th anniversary of the independence of Vietnam this too. So that just show the depth of exchange the past few years. But behind those high level exchange, I believe that the Vietnamese government is trying to navigate the more polarized international environment. You have the US on the one side is trying to pull Vietnam into the US orbit by trade, by military sales, whatever, and on the other side, the Chinese are also looking to keep Vietnam into the Chinese orbit. So Vietnam is trying to say like, hey, we have few options here. And what we can do is that we will match the US pressure on Vietnam to side with the US with another unprecedented move in China-Vietnam relations. So I will say that when you see these unprecedented move in China-Vietnam relation as a effort from the Vietnamese side to reassure China that, hey, we recognize your effort now, but we also recognize your effort in the past when you, along with the Soviet Union and other communist countries, fought for our independence. And that sent a really strong signal to the Chinese that, hey, Vietnam want to send a strong signal, not just to us, but also to the Vietnamese population too, that Vietnam independence is partially a Chinese contribution. So that is still before the 50th anniversary of the end of the war in Vietnam. That is still, I don't want to say a taboo, but the Vietnamese government don't want to recognize that. And I think that left a pretty much a sore spot in China-Vietnam relation, just like the North Koreans don't want to say that we owe our independence or our victory to China. So the same case in Vietnam. So you don't want to say that you owe something to a foreign power. But what the Vietnamese government trying to say to China that, hey, we recognize your contribution and we really value it. That is a really costly signal because if that didn't go down well with the Vietnamese population, that would have hurt the Communist Party of Vietnam legitimacy. But I am glad that it did go down well with the population, as you point out. And I'm glad that this move still in line with Vietnam multilateral foreign policy, because right now, as I am looking at it, the leeway for Vietnam to navigate between US and China is not that huge anymore. 10 years ago, it's huge, but right now it's not that huge. And with the pressure from both sides, then Vietnam will have to take a really unprecedented move to keep its multilateral foreign policy intact.
And I don't want to leave people with the impression that Vietnam's primary engagements are with the Chinese and the Americans, because it's very important to also to remember that Japan and South Korea in particular are extremely active in Vietnam, both as investors, development partners, increasingly in the security realms. There was news today that the Vietnamese military is training in South Korea because they just purchased a whole bunch of new armaments coming from South Korea as well. So there are a lot of pieces on the chessboard, and that's what makes Vietnam so interesting, and again, a frontline state more than any other in the great power competition. And the assumptions that many people in Washington are making about Vietnam, as Khang has pointed out, are faulty and really should be re-examined. And if you really want to understand why, go to the article, Why Vietnam Will Not Balance Against China, in The Diplomat. I will put a link to it in the show notes. And it's another piece of insightful analysis from Khang Vu. Khang, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. Khang Vu is a visiting scholar in the political science department at Boston College. And as you can hear, one of the sharpest minds out there in Vietnamese political science. We really appreciate your time today.
Yeah, thank you, Eric. And I want to thank the audience for listening too. Have a great day.
Wonderful. Well, we want to thank everybody for joining us. And of course, if you want to follow all the work that we're doing at the China Global South Project, go to ChinaGlobalSouth.com. And of course, if you want to help support the work we're doing, please go and subscribe. Subscriptions are very affordable. And if you are a student or a teacher, we have a half-off discount of just $10 a month. Email me at eric@ChinaGlobalSouth.com, and I will send you the links for that half-off discount. Cheaper than a Starbucks run here in the United States, and much better for you, too. So we'll leave it there. Cobus, myself, Géraud, Lucy, the rest of the team, will be back next week. And on behalf of everybody at CGSP around the world, thank you so much for listening and for watching.